Hello there guys, what is going on? Son of Chelsea back here again for another edition of Let's Talk Chelsea. Hope you're all doing well and keeping safe on this Tuesday. Going to be wrapping up in today's video Chelsea's transfer deadline day, what happened, what didn't happen, and all of that good stuff. But before we get into any of that, I want to ask you guys, if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and the notification bell so you never miss an upload. Also hit the like button if you're enjoying the content because it helps out the channel as well. Now, Chelsea's transfer deadline day, in truth, was very anticlimactic for me. It really was. I mean, in comparison to the rest of the transfer window, which I'll probably make a video on later today, reviewing all of it, because it has been an incredible window for Chelsea. It really has. I don't think any fan can complain about this window, but just in terms of the deadline day itself, wasn't that dramatic in truth, and a lot of things that could have happened really didn't happen, and a lot of it in terms of getting potentially another signing in was very much dependent on players leaving that didn't leave in the end. So we're going to get into all of that. Firstly, I think the biggest story of yesterday, the biggest talking point, was Ruben Loftus-Cheek being loaned to Fulham for the season. It wasn't a shock move. I don't think anyone can claim to be surprised by Ruben being sent out on loan. I mean, Lampard made it pretty clear in interviews recently that he could have been loaned out. He's been linked for a loan for over a couple of weeks now, in truth, since that Brighton game and getting him that football. I think the surprise of this move is the destination in terms of it being Fulham, because he was linked to, I believe it was West Ham, Southampton, Newcastle about a week ago. I believe even Aston Villa could have been named, but of course Ross Barkley instead went there on loan. So Fulham is a surprising destination, but just getting into the details of this loan from Matt Law in the Telegraph, brilliant Chelsea reporter, probably the top source in terms of Chelsea transfer news throughout this window. But here he is for the Telegraph. Ruben Loftus-Cheek heads to Fulham on loan as Chelsea decide against Thomas Partey bid. We'll get into that later on in the video because of in terms of Chelsea potentially signing another player this window. Chelsea still value Loftus-Cheek extremely highly, but the player and Lampard felt it best he go out on loan to help his match fitness. Chelsea normally insists clubs cover all of the wages of their loanees, but made a special case of Loftus-Cheek to try and help the 24-year-old. So I think my first reaction for this is, I think objectively, it's good for Ruben to go out there and get first team football again, just for his own career. He's barely played any competitive football over the last 12 months, really. He didn't return till June. He wasn't really a first team player at the back end of last season for those fitness concerns. I think just for his own career, his own fitness, his own sharpness, his own confidence as well, which I'm sure has been hit recently, getting that regular guaranteed first team football at a club that are going to give him minutes, absolutely, I think is massive for him personally and for his development. I don't think this loan is sort of the death sentence I think some would sell you it to be. I mean, I always think about Kurt Zouma. I was speaking about it last week when I had Jay McIntosh on the channel, and I think it was in reference to Ruben, potential loan, where I was making that comparison to Kurt Zouma when he had that terrible injury early on in his career. And he went on loan to Everton. Before that, it was on loan to Stoke. And I think a lot of Chelsea fans, including myself, whilst he was out on loan, not at the club, he felt like his Chelsea career was over and he was going to be sold eventually. But it's proven very different. You know, Zuma's been very motivated. He's returned to Chelsea. And you'd argue at the moment, him and Thiago Silva, one of Chelsea's best centre-backs at the moment. And Zouma could have still a brilliant career at Chelsea. So just because you've been sent out on loan doesn't mean he ain't coming back. But there is that concern, isn't there, because of his age, because of the amount of injuries, also because of the investment Chelsea have put in that area recently of midfield, how stacked it is. I think of other younger players coming through like Conor Gallagher, Billy Gilmore currently on the sidelines as well. I know they don't really play in the same position, but you're just thinking about the amount of names Chelsea have in midfield. They had to sort of trim down as best they could a bloated squad, and a bloated area of the pitch is central midfield. So there is that concern in the long term. Can Ruben find form and then actually return to Chelsea and break into the starting 11? Because you look at Kai Havertz, you look at Mason Mount, both younger than him. You expect to have big careers at Chelsea if they do well. I've always been a massive fan of Ruben. Anyone who watches this channel knows he's one of my favourite players, if not my favourite player in this squad, to be honest, for a while. And, you know, I wrote a long piece for All Things Chelsea, which I'll link down below, which I wrote, I believe, in about June time, just before he returned. And it was about his return to fitness. and sort of believing that he had, and I still think he does have huge potential for Chelsea. The unfortunate thing is, I just think timing is such a big thing in football. It really is. That Massachusetts friendly in what was it, April, May 2019, where he got injured before the Europa League final, where he was on the best run of his career. Anyone that tries to spin you or tell you that Ruben was never good enough for Chelsea, I think that's so disingenuous. And I think the evidence of that 2018-19 season proves you entirely wrong. At the back end of that year, I think him under Sarri was turning into a player we all hoped he could become, and looked like Chelsea's best player alongside Eden Hazard. Unfortunately, that injury really did derail that period for him that was really strong. I firmly believe that if he hadn't got injured, I think he would have been playing under Frank Lampard. I think he would have been a key member of the first team, and I think there'd be no doubt about his future at Chelsea. But unfortunately, that isn't the case, right? And this is where we're at. I really hope just for him, is Fulham the best place? I'm not entirely sure. I think he's going to have a lot of problems this year because of the quality of that squad. He may be able to boost them. He may be able to turn out to be, it's one of those, it could go either way, right? Ruben could really flourish in being the big fish in a very small pond and turn out to be the best player and really be a bit of a saviour this year. I don't know if he's good enough to keep them up in the Premier League because their defending is absolutely woeful. But I think it could be a brilliant time for Ruben to get his confidence, get his fitness back and turn out to be a brilliant player for them. But in the other sense, if you're at a club that's demoralised already, that is going to be on the end of a lot of batterings this season, would that be good for him as well? I think just on the basics of getting minutes in his legs, I think that's a positive. But let me know your opinions on this. Do you think Ruben Loftus-Cheek's Chelsea career is over? Do you think he'll return to the club next year? What do you think about this move? Is it good for him? Is it bad for him? Please let me know in the comments below. The second biggest story for me is Rudiger staying. Antonio Rudiger still being a Chelsea player following this window. A bit of a shock, to be honest, because pretty much from, just before the Barnsley game, we had Matt Law breaking it that Chelsea were looking to sell Antonio Rudiger, being left out of several squads for Frank Lampard recently. And you pretty much expected with about 5 clubs interested in him, taking him on loan, potentially with an option to buy as well, he wouldn't be at the club. But it seems like because of the struggles of selling players, and there's conflicting reports on sort of the background behind Rudiger staying. So firstly, Raphael Honigstein, German football expert for The Athletic here, reporting about Antonio Rudiger because, of course, very heavily linked to Spurs. Apparently, as was reported here, as you can see, The Athletic learned that the German defender had very positive talks with Jose Mourinho and that Chelsea were in principle prepared to let him go to Tottenham on loan. While initially open to the move, it's understood that Rudiger felt wary of the potential fallout from supporters for playing for one of Chelsea's biggest rivals. The 27-year-old decided that he would be better served attempting to fight his way back into the Chelsea starting 11 via a 12-month stint abroad instead. But Matt Law very much reporting on the opposite end of the spectrum in terms of the sentimental thing about Rudiger rejecting to go into Spurs because of Chelsea fans' feelings about it. But according to Matt Law, the deal fell through because Chelsea had wanted Rudiger to sign a new contract to leave on loan, something he was not prepared to do, which left a permanent move as his only way of potentially leaving Stamford Bridge at the end of the summer window. So there are conflicting reports over the situation. You can be very sentimental about it and believe the story about him rejecting the move to Spurs because of Chelsea fans. That's a nice story. That could be very well be true. There's also, I think, the more objective and clinical side of it that Matt Law reports about in terms of him rejecting a contract extension. Both of these things could be true. One could be true, one could be false. I always stress on this channel, I think you can fall down a hole of being too sentimental about players at the moment, and that can lead you down a path of sort of anger if they leave eventually. I'm always I think you have to have a bit of distance and a bit of realism about the situation, about players leaving and moving clubs very swiftly and very quickly in the current state of football. At the same time, it's just a bit of a surprise, and I just wonder what it's going to be like for Rudiger in the coming months until that January window. I mean, is it going to be a Oli Giroud type situation that we saw last season, where not in the sense that he'll break back into the first team, but just he'll sort of be an outcast until January, until Chelsea can find a suitor for him. And you do worry about the dressing room, sort of having a player that is an outcast. Now, it's been widely reported that Rudiger is a very popular member of the dressing room. He is. Apparently, he's well liked by his peers in the dressing room, and maybe that's a positive. In terms of stirring up some sort of controversy, that won't be the case because Rudiger is a good professional. He's liked by his fellow teammates. But you do worry about having players like Rudiger, like Emerson and Alonso. That's equally as surprising to me, both of those still being at the club. But potentially having senior players who are outcast from Frank Lampard's first 11 and potentially having a problem there. But I don't think it's going to be that much of an issue, to be honest. I mean, can he find his way back into the starting 11? I cannot see it, to be honest. I mean, the fact that Frank Lampard, as we've been hearing, has basically told Rudiger, you're not part of my plans, I think it's going to be difficult for him to do that. And I think he's going to spend a lot of the time not being in first team squads. I mean, us being knocked out of the League Cup is a really bad thing for fringe players. I mean, in terms of getting into a starting 11, you would have thought that a League Cup type situation is the best chance for players who aren't playing regularly to get minutes. And maybe he could play in the FA Cup if he's still here early January, but you expect if he does leave, he won't be playing much in that competition. Maybe in the Champions League, best case scenario, Chelsea have the group wrapped up early and he can play maybe a few of the last games in that group. But really, in terms of first team football, I think it's going to take either a massive drop in form from those defenders, which we saw last season, Frank Lampard constantly shifting that back four and Rudiger gets his way back into contention, or an injury crisis. I think that's either of the two scenarios. I cannot see him currently getting back into that starting 11. And of course, this is very much related directly to Fikayo Tomori, because as it became clear yesterday that Rudiger would be staying with Chelsea, it seemed that Fikayo Tomori could still be sent out on loan in the remaining hours of the window, and West Ham became the only potential suitor, with talks going right down to the wire, and Sky Sports reporting that Tomori rejected West Ham basically at the last minute. This would have been an incredible move. I think this would have topped Ruben Loftus-Cheek's move if this would have come through. It wasn't that stunning to me. As I say, 5 centre-backs is a concern to have, especially those who won't be playing. And for Fikayo Tomori, sort of his desperation to get first team football. I mean, if it is true that he rejected it and he personally turned it down with like 10 minutes to go, I mean, how desperate was he to get first team football? Because you felt if he would have gone to West Ham, would have had more of a chance of breaking into their starting 11. I mean, they are playing well at the moment, but he would have got those minutes definitely at that club. But I just wonder, Tomori maybe thinking to himself, I can still break into the starting 11 here. You've got Thiago Silva here. I could form a good partnership with him. It's one game at the moment. I mean, if you look at the Crystal Palace game, you're like, oh, that should be the back five moving forward. But that could rapidly change. Injuries, form, suspension, all of that stuff. And I think Tomori knows probably more than most when you look at his Chelsea career so far. He's very much benefited off of twists of fate. He's very much benefited off other players being injured, getting into the first team and making that place his own. So maybe he could do the same. I just wonder for his own development, him staying this season, if, say, Silva and Zuma create a really good partnership, which we hope they will, how much football is Tomori going to get, and how is that going to benefit his career in the long term? Both Rudiger and Tomori, I think both of them could be in a situation by January where both could be looking for minutes elsewhere. But of course, you get back to the situation where I don't think Chelsea would want to go into the second half of the season with only 3 centre-backs. I think only one of them would be leaving in January, and it's just about who could leave, who would be more of an outcast by then. So let me know your opinions on the whole defender situation. Rudiger staying, Tomori staying as well. What do you think is going to happen in the short term, but also the long term with both of these players? Let me know in the comments below. And lastly, I want to talk about Jorginho, of course, was the other player, and also Callum Hudson-Odoi. I mean, 2 players that I think by the end of the window were forgotten about because they were sort of big players being linked away. Both stayed. But in the case of Jorginho staying at the end, and of course, this is very much being linked into a potential move to Thomas Partey, who eventually went to Arsenal. Of course, Declan Rice as well. I think keeping Jorginho is important. I always felt that, if you're going to let Jorginho go, fine, but we need a replacement. And, we shouldn't be letting Jorginho go, especially to a rival, if we cannot get a replacement in. I always felt Jorginho was unlikely as the summer sort of went on, because I always felt Jorginho was one of these players that wasn't dead wood in the sense that you were going to let him go for cheap. I think Chelsea always wanted a big fee for him. That was being reported by Liam Toomey months ago. And I very much believe that unless it was Juventus, who never had the funds to sign him, or other clubs as well, he wouldn't be leaving really on a permanent basis, or even on a loan. And it looked very unlikely. And even though, of course, Arsenal looking for that creative midfielder, I don't think it was ever going to happen. I think you need to keep Jorginho. He's a senior player, as was proved on Saturday, can still be a very good player for Chelsea on his day. I think now it's on Frank Lampard not getting that defensive midfielder to figure out the balance in his midfield, because now he's got Jorginho. He's going to have to use him at least till January. Maybe we get another move for Declan Rice in January, but at least for now, for the next few months, I think it's on Frank Lampard, given all the transfers he's had, given all the recruitment he's had, to figure out the best midfield configuration to help Chelsea. Because I think Jorginho, if you get the best out of him, can be a very useful player. I mean, it'd be wonderful if the balance between Kante and Jorginho can stay consistent. My only concern is form, also the type of team you're playing. I mean, you aren't going to be playing a Crystal Palace each week. You're going to be playing teams like Southampton after the international break, who will press us higher, like Manchester United, other teams as well. And that's where Jorginho can be exposed. And I think it's on Frank Lampard to try and figure out the best midfield balance, because you've got to do that for at least a couple months. And also Billy Gilmour's fitness not going to be ready at least till maybe Christmas time. So all of that stuff, I think it's on Lampard as a coach to figure that out, at least until he can get another defensive midfielder, say in Declan Rice. So I don't think it's a bad thing Jorginho staying just for squad depth, especially when you're letting Loftus-Cheek and Ross Barkley go on loan. But also on Declan Rice, I mean, as Simon Johnson tweeting here, CFC's inability to get fringe players out has been one of the stumbling blocks in an attempt to sign Declan Rice from West Ham this window. West Ham didn't want to sell anyway, but that hadn't put Chelsea off. Stay tuned next window. So very much linked to Partey as well. You know, Rudiger not leaving, Jorginho not leaving, other players not leaving, raising funds. We saw this throughout the summer, that always being sort of a prevalent theme, and that has been an issue for a lot of clubs. I mean, Chelsea have had a great window in terms of buying players, but selling players in the current market, selling unwanted players, has been very, very difficult. So in the short term, maybe you get the loans of, say, Bakayoko, Zappacosta, but for certain players, they just have to stay at the moment because there aren't clubs willing to pay the money for them, can't fork out the wages for their loan move as well. So that's been a difficulty. I do think that just in the case of Declan Rice, this is a move that will happen eventually. I think it could even happen in January, depending on who Chelsea let go in January, if they can let some players go. I think definitely it will happen eventually. And I think it's good to see once again, as we see the likes of Manchester United rushing out there to get short-term targets. We've seen this before with Chelsea. I have no problem with Chelsea now sort of staying a bit more patient with transfers and saying, actually, we'll wait for our first choice target rather than going in for a player we don't really want. We've had this issue before. You think about the deadline day buys for Drinkwater in the past, getting other players in that sort of scenario as well that you don't really want. You know, short-term fixes that aren't going to help us in the long term, getting players that we don't really want, that the coach doesn't really want. I think, as was proven this summer, going for your first choice target is the biggest priority, and backing your manager fully is a big positive. So I have no problem with Chelsea waiting for Declan Rice, whether it's in January, whether it's next summer. I think Declan Rice will be a Chelsea player sooner rather than later, but it's just about waiting. So those are my thoughts on Chelsea's transfer deadline day. I think I've pretty much covered everything. Of course, Bakayoko going on loan to Napoli, Van Inkel going back on loan to PSV. I got a question about that in a video yesterday. So he went back on loan to PSV for another season. I expect both of those players will be out of Chelsea permanently this time next year. But that's it for Chelsea's transfer deadline day. I'll be making a video on the whole of Chelsea's transfer window because it has been an extraordinary window, even though deadline day itself was a bit anticlimactic. But thank you guys so much for taking the time to watch this video. If you did enjoy it, hit that subscribe button and the notification bell so you never miss an upload. Follow me on Twitter @SonofChelsea. Have a great day, and I'll see you again.